Chapter 13 outlines issues related to the globalization of power, the fellowship of culture, the change of healthcare leaders into perspective that gives example of tools, example of healthcare leaders that can be used to challenge and show change and adaptation of culture in the healthcare organization. It relates to the global leadership, the style of differences, and also the similarities of using appropriate construct to transform transformation leadership. Your book talks about these practices. It shows an outline of healthcare leaders that uses and relates a fellowship of culture, a fellowship of change and knowledge and management. These are those very, very important categorized, showing the global leadership differences according to leaders that use power and technology, knowledge, management, knowledge as such that evaluate the appropriation and appropriate approaches of knowledge management, organization of learning, organization of transformation, organization of leadership, organization within those healthcare organization culture, culture of change. Welcome you. This is the focus of chapter 13. Culture difference in leadership. These are the objectives of the PowerPoint. As the globalization increased in healthcare leaders to need a culturally awareness, culturally understanding, culture of a capable of leading for the people in a diverse background, a diverse educational portfolio that drives that shows diverse outcomes in today's global economy, today's global competition of showing the peers, subordinate staff within those peers and those healthcare environment, geography, nationally. The background is very deep. Likewise, patients and customers need leadership and familiar with becoming in the hospital, familiar with the diversity in those hospitals, the trend that requires culture competencies, adaptive of perspective. For both healthcare leaders, for both organization leaders, culture that are the leader maintains, that adds a complexity to the healthcare leader, that adds a landscape that shows an internal and external factor environment, all very, very perspective importances. In turn, the complexity that lends to the credence for the dynamic of culture of leadership, the dynamic of the mentality and the process in creating a robust organization, in creating amid an environment of change, environment that speeds up in change, also increasing demand with the regards of those importances of this chapter. The text of this chapter uses the reference from Dr. Litlow that state the culture competency that is inherently tied to survival or capability of a leader of social capital. So write down the word social capital, the goodwill of leader possessing within those organizations of followers, the peers, and also superiors, to be more facilitator in the activity that result in closely related, not only the catalyst to those improvement of change of showing those process of performance, but in those organization change. The reality modifies either towards success or towards failure. These are the process and leadership, especially in the healthcare leader. The ability to be for potential for the future, the ability to understand organization, also the ability to understand that globalization is a cause of concern discussing the different perception across all cultures. Individual self oriented, that is orientated in culture, will have significant difference perception of work, a performance, for example. Power distance, high lower means more physical space, high power of culture tend to be the authorities, authorian, whereas power is more equally distributed in a low power culture. Uncertainty, avoidance of risk tasks or risk taking can plan implementation without the information or without the data, of course. The coupling of thick rules, the coupling of guidelines, gender equality, assertiveness of materials and competitive culture tend to masculine, the areas of collaboration, homogeneous or harmonious of those nurturing culture. Take the famine of personality, the high context of the communication and culture, that transfer the meaning with more emphasis on and situation whereas the low context of communication, the low context of emphasizing responsibility to transfer, guess what? Communication, meaning more situation. Number two, your book talks about situation leadership. It's an application that fits nicely in a paradigm of cultural competency. Leader considering the complexity of globalization, complexity of process of leadership expectation that differ depending on culture, society, nation, ethnic, ethnic group of which a leader belongs to, and reside practices. It is difficult to find much literature on leadership outside the Western perspective. For example, the Western perspective and the literature focus and the paragon are based on research conducted within the United States. The United Kingdom, Australia, Europe, to date, more than 90% of this organization behavior, including leadership, are focused within the United States that reflects based of the research on United States theory. All followers. They all follow an attempt to bridge a Western concept, to bridge to bridge a Western or Eastern concept of leadership in the United States. The new paradigm of thinking in the interconnection world has evolved. The healthcare leaders who are successful have many characteristics, many development, many encompassing by the new paradigm, by the new thinking. Your book calls it Thinking in an Open System. It's a contract with fixed idea that states in an integration of multicultural characteristic into maybe a decision-making process. Viewing things globally, acting locally, global of those distribution use of those technology, for example, that scanning all the environment, a full toolbox of knowledge of how to use all of these tools. Personally, characteristics, another one resourcefulness, fearlessness, toughness, competency, humor, playfulness, with the introduction of the most recent worldwide study on leadership. Global study is presented in your book that shows a global leadership study. If you focus deeply in your chapter, the most comprehensive of the global assessment is very important to leadership. Leadership style, propensity, expectation is an ongoing project called global study in your book. The 170 research that was done using 62 cultures that was worked by your author shows a project of many global studies, shows a project of cultural studies, shows a project of derived from previous work of Hosted. The following construct uses this references as pertain to the culture, pertain to the variety of differency, the performance, for example, orientation, how aggressive tasks can be accomplished. Very, very important, assertiveness, how forceful the firm is in that leader. The future of those orientation is for tomorrow, for importance for yesterday and today. The humane orientation, your book calls it. People orientated, the compassion, empathy, emphasis, institution collection. It is a total of the team and the group of collectivism. Your book calls it a small group of orientation of gender, equilibrium of male and females equal to the respect of reward punishment. Very, very important diversity for the power of the distance, how much physical space of normalcy, how much space or leader a person can perceive power, uncertainty, avoidance. All of these are high risks of adverse in the leadership. Thus, implementation of a plan, of task, processing without those information, how intuitive the leader is in the study that are constructed in your book embodies sets of variables, predicaments that shows construction of constructs, finding that are based on each of those constructs. Although the summary of your book shows the highlights, it shows the highlights that are presented in this chapter. It's recommended that healthcare leaders read the study and find the study of global leadership. Research that can be found at the WARE webpage, cited in your book, references, stuff like that, your book reference. The culture of dimension term performance is orientation that emerged from those research, exceptional to the research, importance that reflects the extent of which community encourage or reward of those innovation of high standard of excellency, high standards of performance, high standards of orientation that I've been talking about. The focus of following these factors are not only important, but it is the must. It is the principality of direct communication, direct form of feedback, direct high performance. Performance of those orientation of society places emphasis on what the person does rather than who that person is. Contrast the low performance, the low orientation societies emphasize who are the person, who is the person, rather than what that person is or does. Generally, these specialties in society favor followers. For example, the social tile of family relationship, the environment of harmony of indirect communication, informal feedbacks. These culture dimension your book focuses on uncertainty, avoidance of also emergent factors from all these research. That's a very, very important focus. The extent of these which society factor in. These are not only so important in your reading, evaluates the approach and category of global leadership, alleviating the unpredictable of the future events. Alternatively, alternatively way of thinking about uncertainty, avoiding these stats about those extents of which ambiguity and ambiguous situations are felt as threatened, about the extent of which deliberate the measures, the meaning, the measures of making and enforcement rules and procedures taken to those reducing factor ambiguity. Society that avoids high uncertainty features, following characteristics. All these are so very real important. Resist change, man on those clear policies and those procedure, taking those processes, procedural, deliberate risks are orderly and keep those meticulous recourse emphasizing formality of focus, formality of those society low uncertainty, avoiding the behavior that followings, the ways of leadership. Display only those moderate resistance to change, utilizing informal norms in most situations. Take those risks with less predetermination. Are less orderly, maintaining fewer records, or allowing those greater informality, those reactions. All these are focused on risks in leadership. Constructs each having a sets of variable that were measured that will be found valid, and those into pretending into preventing or into process of leadership performance in the society, which clusters were your book called the 10 sociality group leadership style, that category that measure with 6 grouping of those 21 construct. As you read your book, focus on those charisma of those orientated participants of human self-protection, form of association, construct of traits. It shows in your book a table 13.1 leadership grouping. Style can be defined for the purpose, write this down, for the purpose of making comparison between those styles. There is a considerable overlap in some of these styles. Can you develop a continuum preferred, desirable, to be less preferred, undesirable leadership style, construct? Much of this Allen's focus in the book, and also reading those books and those websites, focus on explaining how 9 culture dimension, the performance, e.g., the performance, orientation, assertiveness, the 7 other independent variables your book relates to, the 6 culture, endorse, and leadership, the third dimension as the IG, charismatic value, based on the team orientation orientated. The 4 others as dependable variables across those 10 to Shalatile cluster. Table 13.1 shows those 6 global leadership I'm talking about. Grouping the style association constructs the global study. Remember, focus on the correct charismatic base, team oriented base, participation human of those orientation base, self-protection, autonomies, culture focus, culture of competencies. There is a strong connection between all these, of course, of leadership, organization culture. Organization are all focus on all success. We discussed earlier the competency for healthcare leaders, the utmost importance of this competency for healthcare leaders, giving us opportunity for education, opportunity for developing competencies that will be strengthened, whereas others will be focused on less. These competencies would greatly mold the role of each healthcare leaders, feel within his or her organization. Paramount to the understanding of these concepts is first to be aware of the culture of the competency. Culture of the competency in healthcare leaders. It is critical to achieving the better healthcare outcomes. It is critical in this multicultural, vulnerable to the population being served. Creating a culture of leadership throughout the orientation that goes hand in hand in developing the values, norms, practices that exemplify leadership, forward thinking, in line with the organization mission, value, goals. Recent culture competency has to gain attention from healthcare policymakers, insurers, educators. Strategy to improve equality, or to eliminate the racial ethnic disparities in healthcare. The goal of cultural competency, however, is to create a healthcare system and a workforce that are capable of delivering the higher quality care of the everyday patient, regardless of race, ethnic, culture, language. Proficiency of culture competency has emerged as important to issue of three practice reasons. First, as United States become more and more diverse, clinical will be and will increase. See patients with broad range of health issues, ethnic, that influence their social culture and background. For instance, or for example, patients may present their symptoms quite differently from ways they are presented in the medical textbook. They may have limited English proficiency, different threshold of seeking care, expectation about their care, unfamiliar with the beliefs of influence that whether they adhere to the provider recommendation. Second, research has shown that the provider communication is linked to the patient satisfaction, medical instruction, outcomes. Thus, poor healthcare outcomes may result when the social culture differences between the patient and provider are not reconciled in the clinical encounter of those communications. Third, culture competency is tangible in expression of concern for people, on empathy of others, assists in a relationship, building a relationship, ultimately breaking the barriers of minority groups that may supply be more pronounced in all areas of healthcare. The Western perspective is what your book might call it. The Western perspective perceived leadership style is summarized includes a Germanic, Europe, Anglo, and cluster in those groups. For Western cluster, charismatic value leadership that was not most preferred or desirable leadership, that style that followed by the team-oriented leadership. Very close in preference to the team-oriented style. That is, participator that shows leadership style. Significant leadership, less preferred, less desirable. That was human-oriented leadership style. Anonymously self-protective leadership style that were not preferred or not desirable for this perspective. Thus is the priority preference of Western perspective. Favor charismatic, a value-based style, team-oriented style, participation style, all this style of leadership, the humane-oriented style, was preferred and desired to only minor degree, whereas the anonymous of self-protective style were not preferred on desirability. Translating the Western perspective into the modern leadership theory, the model is transforming the the leadership, omni leadership of culture leadership model, readily integrated into the perspective and the balance of leadership. Emphasis among the performance of mission, goal, those accountability, accomplishment, and concern to the people, having a team orientation looking forward to the future of vision of achievement and understanding the dynamic of environment. There is considerable conjunction between these models and Western perspective, your book calls it. The Western perspective leadership style prefaces there are other leadership theories. There are models, principalities theories, competencies that we talked about earlier theories, integrating with those well support perspective. There's also the Asian perspective. The Asian perspective theory of leadership style. Intriguing. Includes Confucian, Asian close neighbors, China, Japan neighbors of the southern Asia, of the Afghanistan, Vietnam, including those southern belt of Asia countries. The cluster. For example, the cluster of those charismatic value-based leadership was most preferred and desirable for leadership style, followed by the team-oriented leadership. The next in the preference to the team-oriented style that was the humane-oriented leadership style. A very important and less preferred and less desirable was that the participants of this leadership style, the autonomous of the self-protective leadership style, not only not preferred, desirable for these perspective, yet were more readily tolerated than in those Western perspective in those hospitals there. Prioritizing the preferences, Asian perspective favored the charismatic valley style, oriented with style, human oriented style, the style of leadership, the style of participation style that prefer desirable, non-desirable, moderate desirable, to a degree of the anonymous, autonomous, of self-protective style, where one not preferred but not desired, more readily tolerated by Asian perspective. The most Western perspective. The modern leadership theory can model a silent for an Asian perspective too that could include transformation leadership. That's where I was going with this. Transformation leadership, reframe organization leadership, basically reframing omnibus organization leadership. Your book calls it a culture of leadership model, an older theory Y behavior from theory X leadership, as we talked about earlier in chapters 2 or 3, that matches the integrated contemporary leadership theory. The models to those Asian perspective based on the global style study findings in your book. Another one is the Middle Eastern perspective. We want to write that down too. For Middle Eastern perspective, preferred leadership sometimes prefer the style cluster, including with the landmass from the southern of those Turkey to the Iran, for example, to northwest of Africa, to the Mediterranean Sea, and the social cluster team oriented with the leadership followed by the charismatic value of leadership that the most preferred style perspective of these human oriented leadership style were moderately sometimes preferred, whereas self-protective comes into anonymous leadership style, where at least the tolerance of those prefer of the protective leadership style. Mimic the Asian perspective, whereas the anonymous or autonomous, whereas the leadership has a least desirable leadership style method. The modern leadership theory and the model of the integrating well with this Middle Eastern style perspective will include the dynamic culture, will include the model that transform or what? Again, write this down. A transformation leadership, omnibus of leadership, a model that can also match the integrate these contemporary leadership theories and the models to those Middle Eastern perspective are based on the global study of finding understanding. Another one could be the Latinx perspective. In terms of Latin perspective of this, preferences or preferred of leadership style, the cluster that includes a Latin America, includes a Latin Europe, a Southern Europe borderline or border, these also Mediterranean Sea. The group was this charismatic valley based the leadership was most preferred and desirable leadership style are followed by the team-oriented leadership. The style, next in line with preferences of the team, preferences of the oriented style, preferences of the participation leadership, preferences with the style, but very important, less preferred, and also less desirable, was the human-oriented leadership. The anonymous ontologous of the self-reflective self-leadership style, again, not preferred, not desired, not going, not perceived, not perspective. The Latin Western perspective are very similar based on the result I'm finding in your book. Which leadership, which process theory, which model can relate to Latin leadership? Latin leadership perspective. Can you list this characteristic or charismas of this theory and models in terms of preferred leadership, in terms of preferred cluster, societal? Another one I want to look at is the African perspective. Your book talks about that. African perspective covers this Saharan Africa, similar to the Western and Latin perspective. Although the humane or human-oriented is not the human-oriented possession style are more preferred. And the African cluster and culture, the Western Latin culture, the charismatic of the valley-based leadership was most preferred and desirable to the leadership style, followed by the team-oriented against leadership style. Next, in line with the preferences of the team-oriented, the style as those group participants prefer, slightly less preferred, less desirable was human-oriented leadership again. Style of self-protection, leadership style that were not preferred or not desired. For the perspective, the Eastern Europe perspective goes along too with this. Includes the Eastern Germany, for example, the former East Germany, Russia, the south of Balkans, essential countries, former Eastern Europe bloc communities. The perspective is familiar of the Middle Eastern perspective, where the team-oriented leadership, followed by the charismatic valley-based leadership, was the most preferred style in that area. Participants show human-oriented leadership style that are moderately preferred, whereas protective leadership style, at least not preferred in some cases. Tolerance to those anonymous leaderships, what I talked about, and all the previous other leadership. In the Eastern Europe perspective, it was compared to all other societal groups. The style was not preferred, but will be considering more neutral style. These are the global summary of leadership in the hospital field. The major theme in healthcare leaders to need to understand and apply these conceptions from international research, from international leadership, from international charisma. Charisma, value, orientation, performance matters. Healthcare leaders should focus on accomplishment. Strive in the vision and mission of the organization, leading the people of managing resource, mastering, applying these mastery to sound practice of leadership, competencies of leadership. These demands are vital importance to leaders across the globe. This section reviews the construct of traits highly praised by many, many scholars and accepted across the world. Culturally sensitive and healthcare division of leaders should strive to have the following charisma and charismatic and visionary of those charismatic, and also inspiration of those charismatic, of self-sacrificing, constantly to lead the integrate, decisive performance, the team collaboration, a team diplomat, benevolent in those administration process, competency, as well as leaders in healthcare as an incredible equilibrium that work with people, with different people in countries and community and different social towns, from different backgrounds, from different worlds, that demonstrate a culture of competency, respect, and understanding of what? The difference of diversity, and doing different things, doing the expected expectation. The different perspective is very essential. Leadership challenge is to integrate these differences into a group, an organization, while it focuses on the mission of performance, orientation, striving the vision, the future, orientation of communication, as well as visionary, integrating the people into the mission, into the vision of leading. People, genuine charisma, human orientation, managing the resources effectively. All these are the process of competency in building a team of orientation, a team of diplomat, a team of decisive goal. The healthcare leader needs to accomplish his tasks, a big set of tasks, a big set of shoes, solid morale framework built to trust, honesty, integrity without morality, integrity without honesty, regardless of the culture. This perspective, the leader works in a meaningful or meaningless. As simple as a team, as simple as a leader to develop and maintain an organization. The culture fulfills the mission and vision, while this incorporation, the vast diversity and the vast complexity or complicity that will hold within those sounds, within those ethical process, must be a framework. How leader must accomplish the environment dynamic to change while meeting and exceeding the professionalism standard, professionalism of care and healthcare administration, power to influence, and the basis of power. The power is the capability of a leader to be an agent of influence. Values, belief, attitudes, other people and groups and organization using the power to influence the change of behavior. The changes can be less difficult. Changing the altitudes. The altitudes are less difficult to change than beliefs of value in most cases. Power and influence can be a charisma categorized in the ways that two methods your book presents. Here are the most universal methods your book shows. Power can be discussed in a term. It uses Kelman's social influence theory, shows the process of the social influence. Power can be influence, serving as a catalyst that promotes the resource of response to varying degrees, that is more subordinates, that it targets the leaders, the target of the power or influence, the target of base of the request or requirement, the demonstrated instrumental of the competency and compliance of those international identification, international instrument of compliance that defines a subordinate of target, that defines a person for fulfillment of a leadership request. Action for the purpose of the obtaining a tangible reward of avoiding punishment controlled by the agent. This is an example of the transactional leadership, an action form of foundation of the social exchange theory. Internationalization of defined as a subordinate of target person, of a commitment of the support, of a commitment of the process, the implementation of requests. and an action that requires to fulfill requests made by the leader because they are perceived to be transcendental, desirable, correct relationship, the target, the value, the belief, or altitudes of self-image. In these response to requests, proposal becomes an integrate with the target of person, individual, underlying the value, the beliefs. It is an example of a transformational leadership. Transformation action, identifiable, is defined as subordinate or a target person, limitation to the leader behavior, limitation to the adoption of those same altitudes to please, to lead, and please the leader. These are examples of social learning. Your book calls it a theory in action closely to link to the role of modeling, to link to the role of process. Another way of thinking about this is consider the use of the power influence of subordinates, peers, stockholders, possible of the superior result, and the three possibilities commitment your book mentions: compliance, resistance, commitment. It all occurs when a person or group members or the organization or all members who are focused on the power, focused on the influence from the leader, focused on the internal agreement, internal process, decision-making requests for leaders. They are implemented to approach these fulfilling the requests, implementing the decision requests, implementing the process requests. I welcome you to the course, although I know you joined. But if you are joining, thank you for meeting. The change of the subordinate process and the compliance occurs when the person and group members of this organization members are willing to do what the leader desires. You can write that down. The manner of applying these models or moderate samples of minimal efforts or contribution effort, it's the compliance your book calls it, implies the subordinate behavior, but not this or her altitude, has changed due to the what leadership, change to the influence of leadership. Resistance happens when subordinates or organization members are opposed to a leader, opposed to the request of the leader, or opposed to the activity, avoiding those carry out, perhaps even taking steps to block action, for not fulfilling action, for not fulfilling the leadership request. Of course, there are varying factors, degrees of these commitment, communication and resistance when using power to influence healthcare leaders through access to organization culture, individual culture, the team culture, members culture, personnel culture that impact perception, proceeding as such as this coordinated management of meaning of models that should plan accordingly, that should plan the obvious course. Leaders want commitment, compliances, eliminating resistance. The most recognized basis of power, the influence comes from French and Raven power technology. Your table shows the percentage technology, Keltman's model purpose, synthesizing. I used this already before in the opening comparison. The value, beliefs, altitudes, behavior, those are four. Showing the transformation of healthcare leader. Advantages of solidifying the change in value, solidifying the beliefs, solidifying the altitudes, behaviors in the organization. Charismatic leaders have insights into these needs and hopes. Charismatic leaders, you want to write that down, motivate commitment, proposal, strategy, motivate the change of values, change of beliefs, expresses the strategy in organization, the strategy of plan, charters a statement, altitudes of perception, charters the opinions, charters the members of the group, health organizations that describe how they perceive, how the world should perceive, how they perceive their employees and the staff behaviors, observing action. Healthcare leaders should frequently express expectation about values, beliefs, altitude, behaviors to those subordinate and subordinate staffs in those organizations and stockholders, of course. Knowing our team Knowing the subordinates can assist knowing the values, the beliefs, the altitude. I'm repeating because you should be writing this stuff, behaviors, not only that, but using it in your discussion. Showing the consistency of inconsistencies in those organizations, expressing those values, the mission again, the vision, and what else? What else? The beliefs, behavior, and leadership style that influence values, beliefs, altitude, and what else? Behaviors. Transitional leadership behavior, change in motivation behavior, change in directing behavior, change in action of those subordinates behavior, based on what? The social exchange, your book calls it. The insight, the essence of transaction. Social exchange is the essence of transaction and leadership. Transaction leadership that can alter altitude once the social exchange callus is what? Removed from change. However, it is highly likely that altitudes will return at least to somewhat of their original altitudes or attitudes are stated and transforming leadership focus to lead a desirable behavior by changing the individual, subordinate groups, staff members, stockholders, feeling connected with a healthcare leader and healthcare group team. Organization mission, vision, task, a hand to hand, indirect hand, transforming the oral communication, transforming leadership that can influence subordinate beliefs over time. Healthcare organization culture, transformation leadership. Focus on that this week as you work on your discussion. Focus on that this week as you work on those either case study, showing the horizontal link, showing the capabilities of leadership, the level of leadership, loyalty of leadership, subordinate loyalty, group loyalty. Change means adjusting, revising, redirecting, efforts, action on those behavior, including those subordinates' behavior. Envision the feel about the what? The place you're working right now, the altitudes you're working in right now, the new course. These types of change, more typically of those organizations of change, less frequently of those change may be modified. Those beliefs might be modified values, believe in those subordinate in healthcare organization. Something to keep in mind. But for healthcare leaders, it's important to reflect the interconnection value that links to belief, altitudes, and what else? Behaviors of individuals and those organizations. Organization culture is defined in your book as value, collective value, beliefs, altitudes, and what else? Behavior. I hope you write that down because I've repeated several times. It shows a culture, a construct culture, reinforcement culture, conflict culture sometimes, dynamic ways, temporal one point in time assessment of those construct can be accomplished. Much like climate and organization that assesses those over time. Temporal point, your book calls it a time and sequence, value, belief, attitude, behavior that influences the organization culture, that influences process. Healthcare leaders constantly focus on change, modifying, redirecting individual collective values, beliefs, attitudes, behavior in those organization development. Your book uses Eldridge Shine. This is a good reference. Embedding a secondary reinforcement machinism. It shows an excellent approach and accomplishment. These aspects of those organization culture we're talking about in the healthcare arena. Transformation leadership principle practice are likewise both not only important to the productivity, but to the process in the healthcare firm. So valuing approaches to knowledge and management, organization, learning those transformation and leadership with healthcare organization culture shows the process of change. Analyzing healthcare leaders uses those power relations, those following culture, and those appropriate construct in those transformation leaders process in your division while as you work in those hospital shows examples of tools in healthcare leaders These are the learning objective in chapter 13. So as you go on to chapter 14 as an outside homework, focus on learning those learning objectives. Focus on those learning process. The time is now 46. I have now finished my lecture, and I will take questions